fatal flags, lethal lighters, and both sides even finding a way to use poop as a weapon. Well, that's just plain gross. These are some of the weirdest weapons created and deployed during the Vietnam War, including more than a few that you may never have even heard of. Starting out, let's take a look at the unconventional arsenal of weapons that the Viet Cong were able to get their hands on during the conflict. Actually, most of the actual firearms used by infantry were weird in a particularly interesting way, in that they directly linked to the why the Vietnam War was actually being fought in the first place. You see, most of the weapons, equipment, and even the uniforms worn by some of the members of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army were provided directly by the Soviet Union and China. This included the so-called peasant's rifle, which any gun enthusiast will immediately recognize as the infamous AK-47. It was the ties between North Vietnam and their allies in the Soviet Union that not only gave them access to weapons but also prompted the US's involvement in the war. The AK-47 was only one of the guns provided by the Soviets to their respective allies in Vietnam. It couldn't quite hold a candle to the US's rifle of choice, the M16, with the AK being shorter, heavier, and having a lower rate of fire of around 600 rounds per minute, but the AK-47 was durable and built to last, which is why you still see so many of them in the hands of various armed forces, both military or otherwise, across the world. The infantry also had access to the DP 7.62mm light machine gun, the Soviet equivalent of the US M60 machine gun, and a semi-automatic SKS carbine, similar to the American-made M1 carbine. But in addition to the arms provided by China and the Soviet Union, the Vietnamese Communist forces also knew how to get creative when it came to firepower. A lot of these more standard-issue weapons were provided to the North Vietnamese Army or the People's Army of Vietnam, along with the military-issued uniforms. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong, being an insurgency force, fought in peasant clothing so they could easily blend in with the population of South Vietnam and ambush American forces. While the Viet Cong usually armed themselves with stolen arms from the US soldiers, they also had a penchant for creating their own crudely made imitation guns out of whatever they could find. By using any materials that they could scrounge together, the Viet Cong could craft knockoff versions of American-made guns, like the Thompson machine gun or the aforementioned M1 carbine rifle. They gathered old pipes, door hinges, lock mechanisms, wires, any scraps of copper, steel, or brass they could find, nails, aluminum salvaged straight from downed aircraft, and even ordnance and bullet casings that were already spent. Any broken guns could be repaired, repurposed, or even rechambered in a different caliber, with all these improvised weapons being constructed using simple hand tools in camouflaged huts hidden in the jungle. It's hard to deny the Viet Cong's ingenuity in making guns out of literal scraps, even if these weapons might not have been up to scratch when it came to continuous battlefield use. The homemade guns included a number of single-shot pistols and rifles made from water pipes that could potentially fall apart after only firing a few rounds. But these cruder weapons only needed to be functional enough to kill a single person, allowing a Viet Cong troop to steal a more modern weapon dropped by an enemy combatant. When you're an insurgency force trying to fend off a highly organized military, you'll take every advantage you can get. The Viet Cong proved themselves to be masters at doing exactly that, able to use their environment not just to conceal and camouflage themselves from American forces, but even using the local wildlife as weapons. That's right, the United States Army might have had their AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter, but the Viet Cong had Vipers. And yes, we mean literal Vipers. We're not sure if the bamboo Vipers or venomous pit Vipers technically classify as unwitting soldiers for the Viet Cong, but we're counting them as weapons here. Biological weapons, to be precise. Vipers like these were deployed in pits and traps left behind in tunnels by the Viet Cong, concealed in stalks of bamboo. Once knocked over, a very angry and highly venomous snake would come slithering out, likely none too pleased about being confined in a tube. If they weren't already set on attacking whoever was unlucky enough to find them, then feeling threatened by the size of an American soldier would, in all likelihood, prompt the snake to become aggressive and start biting. Pit vipers were also hidden in bags belonging to Viet Cong soldiers in order to attack anyone who searched through their belongings. Other times, the snakes were tied to tree branches and left to dangle at face height. As cruel as that sounds to the poor, scaly soldiers, that was the intention. Because after a few days without food or freedom of movement, one of those vipers would be angry enough to lash out and bite anything within range, including the faces and eyeballs of US troops on patrol through the jungle. These vipers quickly earned the nickname of three-step snakes, given that an American soldier could make it around 3 paces after being bitten before the side effects kicked in. Bamboo viper venom isn't particularly toxic, however it can cause severe pain and even swelling of the area or a limb that's bitten, as well as nausea and vomiting. In addition, their venom is also hemotoxic, meaning it can disrupt the blood's natural clotting process, destroying red blood cells and causing severe damage to organ tissue. These are all things that a US soldier fighting in Vietnam would rather live without. But speaking of the tunnels we just mentioned, those were yet another key weapon the Viet Cong used against the forces of the US and South Vietnamese. You might not think of a hole in the ground as a weapon, but believe us, by the end of this video you'll want to watch your step anytime you're in a wooded area. The Viet Cong insurgents were able to use a network of underground tunnels to coordinate and carry out strikes against enemy forces, as well as stashing weapons and supplies and escaping detection from any pursuing Americans. These tunnels were cramped, with little space for maneuvering, so much so that US troops couldn't easily pursue Viet Cong forces down them, especially with their heavy, bulky packs and pouches of spare ammo that they were laden with. The Viet Cong used tunnels that could stretch for thousands of feet, concealing chambers at different levels right beneath the Americans' noses, or more accurately right beneath their feet. One of their tunnel networks, located in Chu Chi, was directly below a spot where the US had established one of its major army bases. The issues posed by the Viet Cong using the tunnels became so great that the US Army had to establish and train a volunteer unit known as the Tunnel Rats to some to head into the underground labyrinth and seek out the enemy soldiers traversing through the darkness, with the risk of every step potentially being their last. Snakes and enemy soldiers sneaking around in tunnels weren't the only weapons beneath the surface of Vietnam. Perhaps the most iconic of all the strategies employed by the Viet Cong were the punji sticks. These weren't just simple, easy-to-make improvised weapons, but ruthlessly effective at injuring American soldiers. So much so that 2% of all the US troops deployed in Vietnam received wounds from punji sticks, mostly made of bamboo that was sharpened into a spike. Although occasionally metal spikes were used, punji sticks of varying length and width were used to line the walls of camouflaged pits, as well as protruding upwards from the bottom of those deadly drops. The idea was, an unsuspecting enemy soldier would step on what he thought was ground beneath fallen leaves, only to plummet into a jagged pit and impale himself on a painful punji stick. Leaving the killing of someone up to gravity and some spiky sticks doesn't seem like the best way to ensure your enemy incurs heavy casualties, but what's both weird and interesting about punji sticks is they weren't intended to kill, only cause severe injuries. Many soldiers unlucky enough to fall into the pit of those sharpened sticks would be skewered through the leg, slowing down them and their whole unit as efforts were made to rescue the injured. Those who fell prey to the punji sticks could consider themselves lucky if they were only wounded by a sharp point. The Viet Cong were also known to smear those deadly traps with plant poison and even urine and feces in order to cause an infection in enemy soldiers' wounds. And that wasn't even the only way that poop was used as a weapon during the Vietnam War. But more on that later. Punji sticks weren't the only way the Viet Cong deployed the main weapon at their disposal, Vietnam itself. One of the worst examples of this faced by US troops was simply referred to as the mace. And no, it isn't a medieval-style flail or a can of pepper spray. The mace was a large ball of metal or wooden spikes that would come swinging down from the trees when American soldiers accidentally activated a hidden tripwire. The mace would then either impale any troops in its path as it swung toward them or shatter bones upon direct impact. Traps were some of the most widely used weapons by the Viet Cong, given that their insurgents were under-equipped to take on the Americans in an all-out display of brute military force. Similar to the mace were the tiger traps, which, unlike the snake pits, didn't involve conscripting any local wildlife into fighting alongside them, although admittedly the mental image of someone riding an actual tiger into battle while wielding an AK-47 is pretty cool. Tiger traps consisted of boards that were studded with a series of spikes and barbed wire, and then weighted with bricks. When a tripwire was activated, those traps would drop downward, impaling whoever stood directly below. And if you were unlucky enough to survive, you'd had some pretty nasty stripes left from all the tiger trap's barbed wire. But much like the mace, the bamboo whip might sound like another improvised handheld weapon, but it was yet another tripwire-released trap deployed by the Viet Cong. It consisted of a long stalk of bamboo, which is highly flexible, especially when pulled back into an arc. This time, triggering the tripwire would release the catch holding the bamboo whip, bent out of its natural straight shape. Upon release, it would then spring back into shape, whipping an unlucky soldier and impaling him on several wooden spikes that were fastened to the bamboo. From things that bludgeon and impale to things that go boom and ignite. The Viet Cong might not have had the sheer firepower of the U.S. artillery, but their ingenuity for guerrilla warfare certainly cost American troops a few of their precious smoke breaks, and a lot of fingers too. Look at any photos from the Vietnam War or any media based on it, and you won't have to search long to find U.S. soldiers puffing away like chimneys on cigarettes. The Viet Cong noticed how partial the Americans were to having a smoke and managed to use the enemy soldiers' lighters as weapons against them by creating an explosive disruption to an otherwise relaxing, lung-destroying habit. The Viet Cong started sneaking sabotaged Zippo lighters into American camps, with these Zippo lighter bombs powerful enough to easily take off a soldier's hand when he went to light up his next cigarette. Worst of all, those sabotaged lighters were virtually indistinguishable from any of the ordinary functioning lighters that U.S. soldiers regularly used, making it a gamble if someone's next cigarette might end up being his last. Well, they do say that smoking kills. Lighters were far from the only commonplace battlefield items that the Viet Cong repurposed to fight against the U.S. either. Many of their own belongings were trapped, designed to catch out any Americans who searched their bags, like with the hidden pit vipers we mentioned earlier. But they also managed to turn their own flags into deadly weapons too. Many areas controlled by the North Vietnamese Army or the Viet Cong flew flags that differed from that of South Vietnam, and of course the American flag, which U.S. troops love plastering in places they've captured. Taking down the flag of enemy forces is considered a pretty powerful symbolic action on any battlefield, and the Viet Cong made sure that they left behind a deadly surprise for anyone who drove them out of a location where their flag was flying. Imagine American troops, after a long and intense firefight against the Viet Cong, managing to drive them out of a village. The enemy's on the run, and the engagement seems to be over. A wave of relief sweeps over the soldiers. Right in the center of the village is the Viet Cong flag, and an American GI rushes over to take it down, expecting to raise the stars and stripes in its place, only to be met with the metallic click of a grenade pin being pulled. Too late, he realizes that he's sealed his own fate, and with a boom, a flag trap has been detonated. Whether they consisted of a grenade tied to the rope used to raise and lower the flag, or a landmine at the base of the flagpole, often traps like these were designed to draw other enemy troops in, only to catch them in the blast of a secondary explosive, turning one casualty into several, killing or maiming several. Even though the terrain of Vietnam wasn't exactly the ideal conditions for driving, the U.S. military deployed a great deal of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and other heavy vehicles supporting infantry forces with increased firepower and protection. But as you probably guessed by now, the Viet Cong had their own special way of dealing with these armored vehicles. While shoulder-fired SA-7 Grail missiles were used against the American aircraft that conducted bombing raids over North Vietnam, the Viet Cong had their own weapon for combating tanks and other ground-based vehicles, commonly referred to as simply tank traps. Consisting of a bouquet of grenades attached to a rope, these would be suspended around 15 feet off the ground, connected to a tripwire. This was intentionally set high enough that only something heavy, we're talking tank heavy, could set them off, ensuring that these traps weren't wasted on U.S. soldiers or accidentally activated by wild animals. The 15-foot gap between the falling grenades and the tanks below was intentional too. It meant that a vehicle activating the tripwire would be caught directly beneath the blast when the grenades detonated. But of course, the American forces in Vietnam had plenty of weird weapons of their own, including bullets. Might seem like an obvious one when you're fighting a war, but these weren't the US bullets, they were the enemy's bullets. Let us explain. Project Eldest Son was a mission with one purpose: to sabotage the Viet Cong's ammunition. Using your own ammo against an enemy is tried and tested, but why not turn their bullets against them? Such a dastardly idea could have only come from one place: the Central Intelligence Agency. During the war, the CIA ordnance techs were able to load 7.62mm casings with high explosives. The result? When fired, the sabotaged rounds detonated, driving a weapon's firing bolt backward, impaling the skull of the person unlucky enough to be wielding it. So, intercepting bullets intended for use by the Viet Cong, the US was able to swap out several cartridges in every magazine with the sabotaged bullets. Then, usually during patrols by special forces, the sabotaged ammunition was left scattered throughout Viet Cong territory for the insurgents to find, or even mixed in with their stockpiles whenever the US discovered a Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army ammunition reserve. Even though firing one of those tainted bullets would result in an exploding gun and many metal fragments being embedded in whoever had been firing it, the intention behind Project Eldest Son wasn't to kill large numbers of the Viet Cong. Instead, the goal was to undermine their reliance on the Chinese and Soviet arms and the ammunition that they were using. Stay diabolical, CIA. In terms of their own bullets, the US troops fired plenty of 5.56mm rounds from their iconic M16 rifles, which became the primary service rifle for the US Armed Forces in the early 60s. While you might not think it, the M16 was also actually something of a weird weapon in quite a few ways, given both how dramatic of a departure it was from its predecessors and how effective it was, or rather how ineffective. Replacing the earlier M14 rifle, the M16 was lighter and more compact, thanks in part to being constructed from lightweight materials. You see, the M14 and other rifles that had dominated warfare since the days of the humble musket to the trench rifles of the First and Second World Wars had largely been constructed from wood. What set these shiny new M16s apart was that they'd been made out of steel, plastic, and aluminum alloys, making them both visually distinct from previous service rifles and functionally a completely different beast. Loaded with 5.56mm rounds, the M16 could fire single shots, be set to fully automatic, or even a burst of 3 rounds. The lightweight and compact nature of the weapon meant the soldier wasn't over-encumbered with a heavy rifle and could instead use their strength to carry extra magazines. However, the M16 quickly developed a reputation for being, well, unreliable, to say the least. Misfires, jams, and other malfunctions led to the weapon's earliest users having more than a little disdain for their shiny new toys. This ultimately led to the weapon being redesigned in 1966 to perform better in the wet jungle conditions faced by the infantry in Vietnam. This new updated version, the M16A1, replaced the M16 and went on to become one of the weapons most commonly associated with the Vietnam War. Still, say what you will about the AK-47, but those were built to last, a trait not shared by the early M16. But America's arguably superior fire took on forms that were stranger than the M16 during the course of the Vietnam War. The nature of the asymmetric conflict against the Viet Cong, as well as their enemy's own ingenuity for creating weapons and traps, forced the US to employ their own brand of creativity when it came to making the tools of war. This meant developing specialized weapons that were tailor-made for specific scenarios on the battlefield. One of these was the Silent Sniper Rifle, an odd-looking, bulky weapon designed to take out an enemy combatant without making a sound. Now, every real-life gun nut has made a video about how silencers or suppressors for firearms work and that they don't actually make a weapon silent, as you might see in a movie or video games. However, what set this particular sniper rifle apart was that while it may not have been outright silent, it did make significantly less noise than other weapons of the same size and function. Made by using a modified version of a Winchester Model 70, the rifle had a huge, integrally suppressed barrel, capable of firing .458 rounds at subsonic speeds, meaning the bullets were traveling slower than the speed of sound. Since the bullets weren't breaking the sound barrier, they didn't make the extremely loud pop noise of supersonic rounds as they traveled. Fitted with a scope, the intention behind the design of the Silent Sniper was to make it fire with hardly any sound beyond 100 meters. And the craziest part is, it worked. But given that it was bulky and heavy, the weapon was highly inaccurate, not something you want out of a sniper rifle. Only a few prototypes were ever produced, but were eventually destroyed before the weapon could see deployment. Speaking of silent but deadly, no, we're not getting to the poop yet. The US did have a particularly terrifying weapon in their arsenal that went by the nickname the Whispering Death. Throughout the Vietnam War, the American forces and their South Vietnamese allies conducted thousands of low-altitude bombing raids, not only over the North Vietnamese targets, but also over neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia. American air superiority came courtesy of the B-52s. No, we don't mean the band that gave us the 1989 hit Love Shack. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress was a behemoth of a bomber, powered by 8 turbojet engines capable of delivering massive aerial bombardments, dropping payloads of ordnance in the tens of thousands of pounds. Most carried around 30 tons of high-explosive bombs, the equivalent to roughly 125 100-pound bombs, each one powerful enough to level a city block. So, why was it known as the Whispering Death among the North Vietnamese then? Surely a plane that big with that many engines would have made a hell of a lot of noise, especially when its explosive payload was dropped. Well, that's just what made the B-52 so scary. When flying at 39,000 feet in the air, these planes were silent to anyone at ground level until it was already too late. Launching B-52s from Air Force bases in Guam and Thailand, the United States conducted some of the most devastating and ferocious aerial bombardments in the history of warfare. Among them were Operations Arclight, Rolling Thunder, Linebacker, and Linebacker 2, the sequel. B-52s were responsible for raining high-explosive hellfire over the jungles of Vietnam, as well as Laos and Cambodia, at one point even targeting the North Vietnamese capital city of Hanoi. In fact, these airstrikes were so ruthlessly effective that the President of the United States himself, Lyndon B. Johnson, had to intervene and call an end to the U.S.'s bombing of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. The B-52s were considered to be that much of an unfair advantage. Of course, the B-52 wasn't the only way the U.S. bombed Vietnam. Perhaps the most infamous and widely associated with the Vietnam War was napalm. Even though it was developed much earlier for use against Japan in the Second World War, napalm saw heavy use in Vietnam. This incendiary weapon is made from a jellified gasoline mixture that burns at incredibly high temperatures, enough to kill someone either by burning them alive or causing them to lose oxygen and succumb to asphyxiation before they're done burning. That's right, napalm is hot enough to literally burn oxygen. As effective a killing tool as it was, there is no denying, even at the time, that napalm is an objectively cruel and despicable weapon of war. It's controversial, to say the least, and the horrendous effects of napalm led to many protesting its use, as well as protesting the U.S.'s war in Vietnam as a whole. Fun fact, international law still doesn't prohibit the use of napalm against military targets, and the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons only banned the use of napalm on civilian targets in 1980. Given how trigger-happy troops could be in Vietnam and how the Viet Cong were known to hide among civilian populations, one can only imagine some of the horrifying ways napalm was used during the war. Oh, did you think that airstrikes and napalm were as bad as it got? Well, US troops sure didn't stop there, so neither will we. The Viet Cong weren't the only ones fond of using multiple explosives at the same time. Like the secondary explosives intended to catch American troops in the blast when checking on a comrade injured by an initial explosion. The US had a similar idea, however they took a more direct approach. That is the American way, after all. Flying around 580,000 bombing missions as part of their aerial campaign against the North Vietnamese enemies, the US dropped over 7.5 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Among these were cluster bombs, a type of ordnance designed to release smaller explosives and then scatter them across a wide radius upon detonation, peppering an area with multiple bombs. It almost makes a twisted kind of sense, right? More bombs equals literally more bang for your buck. The worst part is not all of those smaller explosives released by the cluster bombs successfully detonated, with some even remaining a dangerous threat in places like Laos, where efforts to clear the leftover explosives are still ongoing to this day. Cluster bombs were also sort of the older, meaner cousin of a different type of weapon that was subtler and arguably scarier, but it also worked on the same principle. It also was one that commonly was dropped by our old pal, the B-52. The name Lazy Dogs might make you think of four-legged friends, specially trained to sniff out bombs, but these were anything but good boys. Lazy Dogs were actually a name given to a variety of flechettes. This anti-personnel explosive deploys shrapnel or some form of fragmentation to kill or severely injure enemy combatants, and often force their formations to disperse. Picture an explosive like a cluster bomb, but instead of being filled with smaller bombs, it's full of thousands of tiny metal darts or nails. Attack helicopters and ground forces would fire missiles that were loaded with these flechettes in order to tear pockets of enemies to shreds. The Lazy Dog flechettes were unique to the B-52 bomber, and what set them apart was they didn't require an explosion to send the deadly darts scattering in all directions. Since the B-52 bomber flew high enough to be silent to anyone on the ground, dropping Lazy Dogs from this altitude meant they rapidly gained velocity. So in that situation, what's the forecast looking like? Well, a 100% chance of a sudden and silent downpour of sharp metal fragments, resulting in certain death for anyone who stood below. And an umbrella certainly would not help. Explosives are dangerous enough, but Vietnam wasn't simply a war fought with only bombs, bullets, and other bullets that were sabotaged to act like bombs. One of the far less commonly talked about sides of the conflict was the chemical warfare conducted by the U.S. against its communist adversaries, in particular during what was known as Operation Ranch Hand. The U.S. military sprayed herbicide over 4.5 million acres of Vietnamese countryside in order to destroy the forests that acted as cover for the Viet Cong, and to kill off the crops that they and the North Vietnamese army were relying on for food. Roads, canals, rice paddies, and significant portions of farmland were sprayed with over 20 million gallons of herbicide. The most widely used of those chemicals became known as Agent Orange, thanks to the color of the markings on the 55-gallon drums that the herbicide was stored in during Operation Ranch Hand. More than 13 million gallons of Agent Orange was sprayed over Vietnam, nearly two-thirds of all the herbicide used during the entire war. As it turns out, the toxic dioxin within Agent Orange wasn't just a risk to plant life, but to human beings as well. It was also discovered that exposure to Agent Orange could lead to severe long-term health issues, including the formation of tumors and cancer, as well as an increased risk of birth defects in unborn children, along with the psychological scarring from the exposure. The Viet Cong weren't the only ones subjected to those horrendous side effects either. A large portion of the non-combatant civilian population of Vietnam, including the U.S.'s own allies in the South, were affected, as were many returning U.S. service members and their families. Once it became apparent that Agent Orange was far better at giving people cancer than revealing hidden combatants, the USA was forced to change its tactics when it came to detecting enemies. Tracking the movements of the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong in areas like the Ho Chi Minh Trail, as well as the groups that were hiding out in the South Vietnamese jungles, became the job of the people sniffers. While that might sound like an act of public indecency and invasion of personal space, during the Vietnam War, they were one of the key ways that the United States figured out where exactly their adversaries were hiding. Developed by General Electric, people sniffers were mobile cloud chambers that could detect ammonia commonly found in human sweat. That's right, these devices were sweat detectors. It's not hard to see how they gained their nickname. Officially referred to as the XM2 and XM3 personnel detectors, the former version was carried in backpacks by infantry, while the XM3, on the other hand, was mainly used on helicopters. Those who would use the XM2 people sniffers often hated doing so. The problem with the device that sniffs out human sweat is that all humans sweat, meaning the people sniffers would often detect U.S. soldiers' sweat as well as their enemies. Plus, they were very bulky and noisy, which made it hard to ambush any hiding Viet Cong who'd likely heard the Americans coming. It didn't take long for the Viet Cong to figure out how the Americans' people sniffers worked and then just come up with a way to trick those sweat-detecting devices. You see, ammonia isn't just present in sweat, but also in another human body fluid. Before long, buckets of urine were being left out as decoys for the people sniffers. And yes, that wouldn't be the first or the last time that the human leftovers would be used as a weird weapon during the Vietnam War. We've already talked about how the Viet Cong's punji sticks were often smeared with feces to give an unlucky U.S. soldier a bacterial infection. But the American forces also found a way to deploy poop themselves. Another way they attempted to track the movement of enemy Vietnamese forces along the Ho Chi Minh Trail was to place sensors along the routes that they suspected were being used to transport men and munitions. However, these would be easily discovered and destroyed. So, to camouflage those sensors, the U.S. developed, yeah, you guessed it, a radio beacon that was shaped like poop. The United States Air Force would drop those undignified dookie detectors from the air. Those technology-concealing turds would then detect any movement along the trail at night and relay it via a radio signal. Thanks to their disgusting disguise, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army soldiers thought better than pick up what they thought to be perfectly innocent excrement, unaware the U.S. was using the poop to listen in on their movements. Now check out why Vietnam War tunnel rat job was so deadly, or watch this video instead.